Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today we have two in blue. Rolex versus Omega versus starts now. Our contenders are the Omega Seamaster Railmaster, blue denim, and then we have the Rolex Oyster Perpetual 41. We'll start with the veteran of the two, as this reference debuted in 2018. It was a blue denim dial take on 2017's Seamaster Railmaster, and you can see that the watch is easy to wear, 40 millimeters in diameter, 12.7 millimeters thick. It is 46.6 millimeters from lug to lug with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. It harks back to the Railmaster of the 1950s, which was Omega's take on the technician's style watch, which was popular in the era. You can see on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, the watch wears quite easily. Being short across the wrist, I can recommend it for men or for women, and a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference. Now, while it is not as thin as the Rolex, you can see it's still properly thin with a sloped bezel. It's one of the thinnest Omega models that you can buy right now, and it's a good fit under a sleeve if you do want to wear it with formal attire. Taking a quick look at the bracelet, you can see that the bracelet here is decidedly straight and uniform down from the conforming end link that integrates it with the case, whereas on the Rolex there's a much more pronounced taper. Just a quick note, you can also see that the finish on the Omega is all satinated, whereas there are polished highlights on the Rolex. Rolling down to the clasp, take a quick look. It is a twin trigger, double fold deployment. The gauge of the steel is quite thick, but other than using some intermediate sized links, there's not a whole lot of concession here to fine sizing, whereas the Rolex has a little bit more of that. The case is familiar, but what sets it apart is the fact that it is all satinated. There are no polished flourishes here. This is the lyre style lug case that we know from many Seamasters and Speedmasters, but you can see how even the bevels have been satinated to resist glare and make this watch a more viable time teller in any light. Now, as it is slightly vintage inflected, it's not part of the 1957 trilogy. There was a Railmaster trilogy. This is not it. This is more of a vintage inspired watch rather than a re-edition, but we still don't have a crown guard profile. Now, the crown screws in, so does the case back. The watch is 150 meters water resistant, and we come around to the dial side where you can see that even the hands themselves have been satinated to resist glare. We have a lovely blue denim. It is a combination of tones and textures vertically striated to create the look of blue jeans or a jean jacket. Now, you can also look carefully and see that what appear to be purely printed indices are actually slightly inset into the dial. It's got nice symmetry about it with a crosshair style and quarter Arabic numerals, and then a railroad track outboard with lightly contrasting a reddish brown seconds hand and Railmaster script. Inside, we've got Omega caliber 8808. It's the same movement found in the Diver 300 meter, albeit without a date. It's an automatic winder. It's coaxial. It's a master chronometer. It has a 55-hour power reserve. It's anti-magnetic. It's shock resistant. It has a stop seconds function. We'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about mechanical advantage relative to its opposition. Let's talk about the relative newcomer. This is part of the new for 2020 41 millimeter Oyster Perpetual family. Previously, the largest ever offered had been 39 millimeters. Well, that model was retired, the 41 arrived, and now this reference 124300 gives you the wrist presence of something like a GMT or a sub in the classical OP case. Now, I should also mention that this turquoise blue dial, at least on the 41 millimeter watch, has been discontinued. So the watch you see here represents a timepiece that is only obtainable via the pre-owned market. 41 millimeters in diameter. It is slimmer than the Omega at 11.8 millimeters thick. We'll get a little bit closer for detail. You can see from lug tip to lug tip, 47.4 millimeters, and end link to end link, the total distance across the wrist is 51.5 millimeters. We've got a little bit of a broader lug spacing, which is fitting as it is a larger case. It's 21 millimeters in between the lug horns, and if I may, I would opine that the Rolex integrated end link better integrates the bracelet to the case than the Omega end link. The Oyster bracelet's well established. It's been around for eons. Here we have satin finished tops, polished outer flanks. There is a pronounced taper to it. Removable links are fixed by screws, and we have a clasp that I consider to be just a little bit better than the Omegas. We have a lift lock system, so you can see internally there's a spring-loaded beak and a hook. Thick gauge steel, all polished. That's new on the current generations of Oyster Perpetuals. Previously, they would have been media blasted internally. And then something else that's new on the current generation of Oyster Perpetuals, the 5mm EasyLink tool-free adjustment system where you can snap in or snap out. There are also 3 divots drilled inside the clasp, so you can use your strap tool to fine-tune the fit by moving the anchoring point of the bracelet inside of the clasp. The case is thinner, finer, a little bit more nuanced. It has a combination of polish and satin. We've got a twin lock crown and a screwed-in oyster case back here, so 100 meters water resistant. The dial is described as blue turquoise. Everyone calls it Tiffany blue, and there's absolutely no doubt, given their mutual history, that Rolex had Tiffany in mind when it created this dial color for the 2020 model year. Now, where this watch pulls ahead a little bit qualitatively from the Railmaster is in the use of white gold for the applique indices rather than the transferred indices you see here. So these are all applied along with the logo, and they're 18 karat white gold. So are the hands. The idea is to resist tarnish and oxidation over time. Inside the case, we have Rolex caliber 3230. It's an automatic winder with a 70-hour power reserve, stop seconds. It's got a full balance bridge, a free sprung balance, an overcoil hairspring, a chronometer certification, and Rolex goes above and beyond the chronometer minimum, which is a 24-hour timing of no worse than -4 + 6 seconds. Rolex tests the fully cased-up watch with its chronometer certified movement and assures it runs no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day at the time it leaves the factory. Now, let's talk about advantages these watches have relative to each other. You can see when I put this one on my wrist, it's a much larger timepiece. Not thicker, not by a long shot, but definitely broader. Here there are going to be some limits on the size of the wrist that can wear this watch, whereas the other one could be worn on a wrist of as little as 13.5 centimeters circumference. You can see here that my 16 centimeter circumference wrist is being taxed a little bit, and I really do think that the minimum for wearing this watch would be about a 15 centimeter circumference wrist. It does, however, fit more easily under a cuff, as it is flatter with a nice domed bezel. There are going to be no fit issues in that regard. The watch is impressive, but also it's a little bit unconventional in that this upsized Oyster Perpetual case is beginning to take on the profile of a sort of tonneau more than a round case, and that is in distinct contrast to the Railmaster, which is more of a classical round case design. All right, let's talk about advantages, and it has to start with the value proposition. Let's say you could find one of these still new in a dealer case. Well, the retail price would be $6,150. Pre-owned, this watch is going to be between $23,000 and $25,000 right now. Now, it's true there are still dealers online listing these for $40,000, $45,000, $50,000, but they're simply smoking a crack pipe where they're underwater, having paid too much for the watch back in the spring. Right now, this watch, full box, full paper, full set, outstanding condition, unmarked, should be $23,000 to $25,000, which leads me to the conclusion that if you can still buy this watch new, it's the one to buy new between the two. Also important, it's the better long-term prospect, being the first ever 41mm Oyster Perpetual, and as you see it here, already a discontinued model. Rolex is always a great long-term collector prospect, but more so when you're dealing with a particularly provocative discontinued reference like the turquoise dial on the Oyster Perpetual 41. Now, you also get evergreen design. The Oyster Perpetual has been around since 1933, and the Oyster case itself has been around since 1926, and it is a certainty that the owners of those foundational watches would recognize this, were they still alive today, as a descendant of their timepiece. And I have no doubt that come the Oyster Perpetual Centennial in 2033, heck, 100 years from now, this will still look like a Rolex Oyster Perpetual. Also important, power reserve here, 70 hours versus 55 on the Omega. 70 is decisively more, and it gives you almost the industry standard of 3 days, which is nice to have. Clasp quality, the way it feels, the way it works with the extra adjustment, and the fine quality of polishing internally. You just have a little bit more adjustability within this clasp, and it has a little bit more substance and solidity to it. The bracelet is also a little bit more nuanced, with a better conforming end link, a pronounced taper, and that contrast between the polish and the satin, which I appreciate. Also important to note the status symbol. It's not the reason I buy luxury watches, but between the two, the Rolex is the one that speaks to the prestige and the privilege of owning a luxury watch, and for some folks, that's the reason they buy a Rolex. Also important that you're getting a relative value here, as Rolex is often discussed as the status and stature equal of brands like Patek Philippe and Richard Mille And frankly, even if you buy this watch pre-owned, you're not going to pay anywhere near what you would pay for a 5711 or an RM1103. So this is really the deal in that regard as well. If you're part of the society set, this is going to cost you a lot less than a Patek or an RM. Thinner. There's no doubt it's thinner, and it's a lot thinner. I'm going to do what I can right here to give you some detail of just how much thinner it is, but you can see that the Omega is a thicker timepiece, and it's also sheer of side, whereas the Rolex case flank is curved. So this watch has a more elegant profile when it is on the wrist. And then finally, the applique dial with the white gold indices, hands, and logo. It's just more expensive to make and more refined in appearance than the dial you have here, which is relentlessly flat and one-dimensional. Okay, what does the Omega do better? Well, let's talk about price, new and used. Unlike the Rolex, you still can buy the Denim version of the Railmaster as a new timepiece, and it costs $5,200 if you get it on the bracelet as seen here. Pre-owned, full set, this watch is going to be about $3,500 to $3,700, depending on whether it's still under warranty. Also important, this is an unassuming watch that grants you a degree of privacy. The double-edged sword of the status and stature that comes with a Rolex is the amount of attention it draws. Sometimes it's annoying, people asking, is it real? Where did you get it? Are you rich? How much does it cost? But then there's also a sinister aspect where some people will case your wrist for a unauthorized transfer of the product down the line, whereas with an Omega, that's far less likely to happen. People comment that it looks nice, it's a handsome watch. If you show it to them, they're generally appreciative, but questions don't center around its value or your wealth or whether the watch is a counterfeit, and people are far less likely to follow you home to obtain the goods. Also important, although both of these watches are highly anti-magnetic, this has an anti-magnetic escapement, this has an anti-magnetic escapement. This has a niobium zirconium anti-magnetic hairspring. This has a silicon anti-magnetic hairspring. This is going to be the more anti-magnetic of the two, and that's no small matter in the era of high-powered home office environments, home or office. You're going to deal with a lot of electromagnets as well as powerful static magnets, perhaps even in the speakers of your laptop. And I've had watches magnetized. Now, neither one is a likely candidate to become magnetized, but this watch, according to Omega, is resistant to over 15,000 Gauss, which is insane, effectively rendering it amagnetic, not anti-magnetic. Also, the coaxial escapement remains profoundly cool, and while the Rolex Chronergy escapement is its technical equal, the coax has the George Daniels association, plus the fact that it is more exotic in design, being a tangential contact to direct and indirect impulse tri-level escapement. So technical interest is here. Also, the Master Chronometer certification has everything the COSC has, but it also includes water resistance, winding efficiency, power reserve, shock resistance. It is a full cased-up watch test of more than just chronometry, and it's so impressive as a standard that Rolex's sister brand, Tudor, has begun to Master Chronometer certify some of its watches. Also, 50 meters of extra water resistance, 150 versus 100, not a big deal, but an advantage nonetheless. Better small wrist fit, and that comes down to being just over 46.5 millimeters from lug-to-lug. At 51.5 lug-to-lug, you're going to see some real constraints on how small a wrist can wear the 41, whereas this watch will fit on any wrist that can wear a Rolex Oyster Perpetual 36. Now, also important, this watch was designed to work with a strap custom-made for the model. Although this is on the bracelet, you can get a leather and denim strap for the Railmaster Seamaster Denim that looks absolutely wild. There is no such Rolex factory accessory for the Oyster Perpetual. Dial detail is different here from dial quality. Rolex dial quality is higher, but here there's more to see. You have the striations, which are so deep as to have their own separate texture. There are several different tones ranging from cyan to navy blue, and there's a gentle contrast between the reddish brown of the Railmaster script, the second hand, the crosshair dial center, and the quarter Arabic numerals with the vintage style indices. I just like the detail here, and the low glare aesthetic complemented by the satin finished hands is just a holistic element that's consistent with the rest of the watch's design. Also important, low glare dial and case. While I do like some of the jewelry elements here and the polished contrast, this is the one that's less likely to blind you in bright sun. Plus, I believe the Omega has better lume. So I'm going to get real close now and let you guys be the judge, but I think the Omega has the better lume of the two. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's see how they go. And you can see they're similar in color and brightness, but The luminescent plots on the Omega are just larger. Plus, Omega gives you a luminescent seconds hand, which is something Rolex does not. Especially after the initial burst of energy dissipates, you can see why the Omega has a better loomed dial in almost every regard. Now, which one would I choose for myself? Well, I have to be perfectly honest that if value is a consideration, you can't beat this watch for $3,600 compared to paying $2,400 or $24,000, $25,000 for this watch. The pricing here just makes solid sense. I would also say, realistically, the watch has the same degree of technical interest. Some of its capabilities, especially regarding water resistance and anti-magnetism, put it in a class above the Rolex. That said, the Rolex is so beautifully refined, and power reserve is a major priority for me. Plus, I love things that have evergreen design qualities. Things like the Morgan Plus 8, the Porsche 911, an Eames chair, the Fisher Space Pen. All of those things, like the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, are iconic designs that have stood the test of time. And while I wouldn't choose my Oyster Perpetual on the turquoise dial, I would absolutely opt for one with the yellow, coral, or green dials. So if price is no object, based on longevity, refinement, extra power reserve, I would actually pick the Oyster Perpetual over the Omega. But price is always a consideration, and I cannot overlook the fact that at $3,600, this is an impossible detail to beat. Plus, you get that anonymity when wearing your luxury watch in public. Guys, let me know in the discussion below, which of these watches would you pick if price is and isn't a consideration?